Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that the sound of traffic has disappeared. No engines, no electric lights, no distant sirens. Only the steady ringing of church bells carried by the morning mist and the muffled footsteps of thousands of people beginning another ordinary day. You open your eyes and find yourself standing in London, but not the London you know. This is the year 1348, and although the city is already one of the busiest places in Northern Europe, its future is balanced on the edge of an event that no king, physician, or merchant is prepared to face. At first glance, everything appears remarkably familiar. Bakers are already tending their ovens before sunrise. Merchants are arranging cloth, spices, and tools beneath wooden stalls. Apprentices hurry through narrow streets carrying supplies for their masters, and children weave effortlessly through the crowds, as though every twisting alley were part of a game they have known since birth. Life moves with confidence because routine has a way of convincing people that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. It is one of history's quietest illusions, and perhaps also its most dangerous. If someone had stopped a passerby that morning and asked whether London was thriving, many would likely have answered yes. Trade connected England to ports across Europe. Churches dominated the skyline. Guilds regulated skilled crafts, and ambitious builders continued to expand a city that seemed destined to grow even larger. To those who lived there, this was not a civilization in decline. It was a society investing in its future, solving problems one generation at a time, and believing that careful work would gradually create a better world for those who came after. That belief deserves more respect than it often receives. Modern stereotypes encourage us to picture medieval Europe as a place trapped in darkness, but history tells a far more nuanced story. These were communities filled with capable builders, experienced physicians, devoted craftsmen, determined farmers, and local officials who genuinely believed they could improve the places where they lived. Their understanding of nature was incomplete, yet their determination to build stable communities was very real. As we move through this forgotten world together, I want to ask you to resist one temptation. Do not judge these people by what they failed to know. Instead, watch how they observed their surroundings, how they solved practical problems, and how they relied on experience passed from parents to children over countless generations. You may discover that the distance between their world and ours is smaller than it first appears, because every civilization, no matter how advanced, depends on knowledge that is still unfinished. That is where our story truly begins, not with sickness, but with ordinary life. Before we can understand why one epidemic altered the course of European history, we first have to understand the city that welcomed each new sunrise believing it had another ordinary day ahead. And perhaps the most unsettling question we will face tonight is not why medieval society failed, but whether any society can ever recognize its greatest vulnerability before history chooses to expose it. London did not become one of Europe's most important cities overnight. Generation after generation, its walls expanded, its markets attracted merchants from distant shores, and its docks welcomed ships carrying wool, timber, wine, salt, and countless other goods that connected England to a rapidly changing continent. Every arrival brought opportunity, but it also introduced new challenges that few people paused to consider while prosperity continued to grow. The city itself was a living machine powered by human effort. Water had to be collected, food transported, animals cared for, buildings repaired, and waste removed, all without the technologies we now take for granted. Each sunrise demanded thousands of small tasks performed with remarkable precision, because if even one part of that fragile system failed for long, daily life could quickly become far more difficult than anyone expected. Despite these limitations, medieval London was anything but lifeless. Markets echoed with negotiations spoken in several languages, the smell of freshly baked bread mixed with smoke from countless hearths, and skilled craftsmen transformed raw materials into objects that would travel across kingdoms. To many visitors, the city represented wealth, ambition, and possibility rather than decline, reminding us that every great urban center carries both its strengths and its hidden weaknesses beneath the same crowded streets. Health was one of those concerns that occupied both ordinary families and civic leaders. Physicians relied on the medical knowledge inherited from Greek, Roman, and Arabic scholars, while monasteries preserved valuable texts and practical remedies that had survived for centuries. Treatments often reflected theories we now know were incomplete, yet they were developed through careful observation rather than simple superstition, revealing a society that continuously searched for answers even when the true causes remained invisible. Public officials also understood that crowded cities required rules. Streets were expected to remain passable, marketplaces were supervised, and regulations attempted to reduce conditions believed to threaten public well-being. Enforcement was uneven and success varied from neighborhood to neighborhood, but these efforts reveal an important truth. Medieval communities were actively trying to create order in environments that were becoming more complex with every passing decade. Yet complexity has a habit of producing consequences that remain hidden until circumstances expose them. A city can appear healthy while unseen vulnerabilities quietly accumulate beneath the surface, much like the foundations of a building that seem perfectly solid until the day unusual pressure reveals every unnoticed weakness. History repeatedly teaches this lesson, though it is often recognized only after events have already changed the lives of thousands. Trade, the very force that enriched London, also connected it to places far beyond the horizon. Ships crossed seas carrying valuable cargo, caravans linked distant regions through long-established routes, and travelers moved from town to town in search of work, pilgrimage, or opportunity. Every journey strengthened commerce, spread ideas, and encouraged prosperity, but it also created pathways along which unexpected dangers could travel without attracting immediate attention. Imagine standing beside the River Thames as another merchant vessel reaches the docks after weeks at sea. Workers unload barrels, crates, and bundles while buyers inspect the latest arrivals with excitement, seeing only the promise of profit and fresh supplies. No one watching that ordinary scene could measure the invisible passengers that sometimes accompanied commerce, because the greatest threats were not always hidden inside the cargo itself, but within the intricate web of life that surrounded it. This is where our understanding begins to shift. The story of the Black Death is not simply about a deadly disease arriving in Europe. It is also about how an increasingly connected world could unknowingly carry both prosperity and disaster along the very same routes. And before the first alarming rumors reached London streets, the conditions that would shape the coming months were already spreading silently across a continent that believed it was entering another ordinary year. So as we continue this journey, keep one thought in mind. The people we are about to meet did not know they were living through the final days of a familiar world, just as none of us can identify the ordinary moments that later generations will describe as the beginning of history. That uncertainty, more than anything else, is what makes the past feel so remarkably alive. For centuries, people have searched for a single explanation for the catastrophe that swept across Europe in the middle of the 14th century. Some blamed the stars, believing unusual alignments had poisoned the air. Others pointed to earthquakes in distant lands or changing winds that seemed to carry sickness from one region to another. These ideas may sound strange today, but they were genuine attempts to understand a world that offered few visible clues. When every answer must come from observation alone, even the smallest pattern can begin to feel like certainty. Medical practice reflected that same search for order. Physicians studied respected authorities whose writings had shaped European medicine for generations, carefully comparing symptoms, recording outcomes, and prescribing treatments they believed restored balance to the body. Their conclusions were based on the strongest knowledge available, not on carelessness or indifference. Looking back with modern science, it is easy to notice their mistakes, but it is far more revealing to recognize how seriously they pursued answers despite working without the tools that later transformed medicine. Daily life continued because it had to. Farmers still harvested crops beyond the city walls. Fishermen returned with their catches. Blacksmiths repaired broken tools. And merchants negotiated prices that would determine whether a family prospered or struggled through the coming winter. Life has a remarkable ability to preserve routine even while unseen dangers gather in the background. The ordinary rhythm of work often becomes the very thing that hides extraordinary change until it can no longer be ignored. Communication traveled slowly compared with our own age. News arrived through travelers, merchants, monks, and official messengers, changing slightly with every retelling as it crossed rivers, forests, and mountain passes. A troubling rumor from a distant port might take weeks before reaching London, and by then it often sounded more like an unbelievable tale than an urgent warning. Distance created uncertainty, and uncertainty allowed hope to survive longer than the facts deserved. Imagine hearing that an unfamiliar illness had appeared hundreds of miles away. Would you immediately believe it threatened your own family? Or would you assume that the reports had been exaggerated somewhere along the journey? Most people chose the second possibility, not because they ignored danger, but because experience had taught them that frightening stories often faded before reaching their own communities. That instinct, so deeply human, would prove far more powerful than anyone realized. Meanwhile, Europe had become increasingly connected through commerce. Every successful trading season strengthened relationships between ports, markets, and inland towns, weaving together an economic network that benefited nearly everyone involved. The same roads that carried cloth, grain, metal, and wine also carried thousands of travelers, each adding another link to an ever-growing web of movement. Few celebrated these connections more than merchants, because prosperity depended on them, and for many years that confidence seemed entirely justified. No one standing on a crowded dock could see history taking shape. Sailors secured ropes, laborers unloaded cargo, buyers inspected merchandise, and scribes recorded transactions with careful precision. It was a scene repeated countless times across Europe, ordinary enough to escape notice, yet powerful enough to influence the fate of entire kingdoms. History is often written through dramatic moments, but it is built from quiet routines repeated day after day. As winter slowly gave way to spring, scattered reports became more difficult to dismiss. Communities that had once seemed safely distant began describing similar patterns of illness, similar losses, and similar confusion. Even then, certainty remained elusive. Without rapid communication or scientific investigation, people struggled to separate fact from rumor, hoping that the next message would finally bring reassurance instead of deeper concern. That growing uncertainty forms the heart of our story. Before fear filled the streets, before chroniclers began recording unimaginable losses, there was a brief period when Europe stood between disbelief and acceptance, unsure whether it was witnessing isolated misfortune or the beginning of something far greater. It is within those uncertain weeks that we find one of history's most powerful lessons. Civilizations are rarely transformed in a single instant. More often, they cross invisible thresholds without realizing they have already left the familiar world behind. There is a curious illusion that history often creates. We look backward across hundreds of years and imagine that people living in another age somehow sensed the great events that were about to reshape their world. We picture kings preparing for war, physicians anticipating mysterious diseases, or entire cities expecting disaster just beyond the horizon. The truth is almost always far quieter. On the morning of an ordinary day in early 1348, London woke exactly as it had countless times before. Fires were lit before dawn. Shopkeepers raised their wooden shutters. Fishermen returned along the Thames with the night's catch, and the streets slowly filled with the sounds of commerce. To everyone living there, the future still felt predictable. London was already becoming one of the most influential cities in England. Protected by ancient walls first raised centuries earlier, it had grown into a thriving center of trade where merchants from across Europe exchanged wool, cloth, spices, metals, wine, and countless other goods. The River Thames was its greatest advantage, carrying ships that connected the city to ports hundreds of miles away. Every vessel that reached the docks represented opportunity. New products, unfamiliar faces, foreign languages, and fresh ideas flowed into the city alongside barrels of grain and bundles of timber. Few places better represented the growing interconnectedness of medieval Europe. Yet the city remained surprisingly compact by modern standards. Tens of thousands of people lived within a relatively small area, their homes pressed tightly together along winding streets that had evolved over generations rather than following any carefully planned design. Many buildings rose 2 or 3 stories high, their upper floors extending outward until neighboring houses seemed almost close enough to touch. Sunlight struggled to reach the narrow lanes below, especially during winter, when damp air lingered between the buildings long after sunrise. Walking through these streets, a visitor would immediately notice how every available space had found a purpose. Life unfolded at street level. Bakers displayed fresh loaves still warm from their ovens. Butchers prepared meat beneath wooden awnings while apprentices swept sawdust across workshop floors. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into tools that farmers and craftsmen depended upon every day. Tailors measured cloth imported from distant regions, and merchants negotiated prices with remarkable patience. Every profession relied on another. Every household depended on dozens of occupations it would never directly see. The city functioned because thousands of individuals performed small, ordinary tasks that together created an intricate web of cooperation. This daily rhythm was governed as much by the church as by the marketplace. Bells announced the passing of time long before mechanical clocks became common. Their sound called people to prayer, marked important occasions, and quietly organized the routines of an entire population. For many residents, these familiar chimes provided reassurance. They suggested that the world remained stable, ordered, and understandable. Even when harvests failed or political tensions rose, daily rituals created the comforting impression that life itself remained firmly under control. Behind every front door, however, families faced challenges that modern households rarely consider. Water was not available by simply turning a handle. Every meal required fuel gathered or purchased in advance. Preserving food demanded constant attention, especially during warmer months, and every object inside a home represented hours, days, or even weeks of skilled labor. Nothing was disposable. Clothing was repaired repeatedly, wooden furniture was carefully maintained, and metal tools passed from one generation to the next. Survival depended less on convenience than on resourcefulness. Children learned this reality almost from the moment they could walk. They carried water, gathered firewood, delivered messages, assisted in family businesses, and gradually acquired practical skills that would define adult life. Education, where available, differed greatly according to wealth and occupation, but experience itself served as a powerful teacher. By observing parents, neighbors, masters, and craftsmen, young people absorbed knowledge that books alone could never provide. Every street became a classroom, every workshop a place where generations quietly exchanged experience. Looking back from the 21st century, it is tempting to measure medieval society only by what it lacked. Yet doing so risks overlooking something equally important: its remarkable ability to adapt. Within the limits of contemporary knowledge, people developed solutions to problems that confronted them every single day. They organized trade across great distances, built durable structures, established legal systems, and sustained communities that continued growing despite frequent hardships. Their world was imperfect, but it was neither chaotic nor directionless. It was a civilization constantly experimenting, learning, and adjusting to circumstances that often lay beyond its control. That perspective changes the questions we ask. Instead of wondering why medieval people failed to prevent the catastrophe that was approaching, perhaps we should first ask how they managed to build such vibrant communities despite the extraordinary limitations they faced. Because before history became a story of plague, it was first a story of human resilience. And understanding that resilience is the key to understanding everything that followed. As the first light crept over the rooftops of medieval London, another city was already awake beneath the one most people noticed. Long before merchants greeted their customers or craftsmen unlocked their workshops, laborers hauled water through the streets, stable hands cared for horses that would soon pull heavy carts, and servants prepared fires that would warm homes against the morning chill. These quiet routines rarely appeared in chronicles written by kings or monks, yet without them the city could not have functioned for a single day. The true strength of London did not lie in its walls or its wealth, but in thousands of ordinary people performing essential tasks before the rest of the population had even opened their doors. Water shaped nearly every hour of daily life. Families needed it for cooking, brewing, washing clothes, cleaning tools, and caring for livestock, making a reliable supply as valuable as food itself. Some households collected water from public conduits or nearby wells, while others purchased it from professional water carriers who transported heavy containers through crowded streets from dawn until dusk. Obtaining enough water required planning, physical effort, and time, reminding every resident that even the simplest necessities demanded work long before modern convenience existed. Because every bucket had value, people used water carefully rather than wastefully. A single supply might serve several purposes before finally being discarded, reflecting a practical mindset shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. This was not a society that ignored cleanliness, but one that balanced hygiene against the considerable effort required to secure the resources needed for everyday life. Understanding that difference helps explain why medieval habits often appear unfamiliar when viewed through modern expectations. The streets themselves reflected the complexity of a rapidly growing city. Main roads bustled with traders, travelers, carts, and animals moving side by side, while narrower lanes connected homes, workshops, inns, and places of worship into a dense network that never seemed entirely still. Every sound carried meaning. The ringing of iron against an anvil, the calls of merchants announcing fresh goods, the creaking of wooden wheels over uneven ground, and the steady conversations of neighbors who often knew one another for decades. To an outsider, the city might have seemed chaotic, but to its residents these sounds formed the familiar rhythm of everyday life. Markets stood at the heart of this rhythm. They were more than places to buy food. They served as meeting points where news spread, agreements were made, and communities remained connected. A visitor could find fish brought from nearby waters, grain delivered from surrounding farms, vegetables grown beyond the city walls, and imported goods that had crossed seas before reaching London. Every successful market day reminded people that their city depended on an intricate network extending far beyond what they could see from its gates. Yet dependence on distant trade also created a hidden vulnerability. Every ship that arrived, every caravan that entered, and every traveler seeking opportunity strengthened London's connection to the wider world. Those connections fueled prosperity, encouraged innovation, and expanded commerce, but they also ensured that the city was never truly isolated from events unfolding hundreds of miles away. In an age without rapid communication, change often arrived long before news of that change reached the people whose lives it would soon transform. Few Londoners paused to consider how interconnected their world had become. To them, the arrival of foreign merchants was simply another sign that business was thriving and that the city continued to prosper. Looking back today, however, we can see that medieval Europe was already linked together by countless routes of trade and travel, creating a continent where ideas, cultures, technologies, and, eventually, dangers could move farther and faster than previous generations had ever imagined. That growing web of connections would soon become one of the defining forces in the story that was about to unfold. If there was one place where London's heartbeat could truly be felt, it was the marketplace. From the earliest hours of the morning until the fading light of evening, these open spaces became the center of economic life, where nearly every social class crossed paths. Wealthy merchants negotiated contracts worth fortunes while laborers counted a handful of coins before deciding what they could afford to bring home for supper. Between them stood craftsmen displaying their finest work, farmers unloading produce from nearby villages, and traders speaking accents from places many Londoners would never see. Every conversation, every purchase, and every bargain reflected a city growing more connected to the world beyond its walls. Food arrived through an astonishing network of people whose efforts often went unnoticed. Grain harvested in the countryside passed through millers before becoming flour. Bakers transformed that flour into bread that would feed hundreds of families before the day was over. Fishermen worked the Thames and nearby coasts, while drovers guided livestock toward the city gates after journeys that sometimes lasted several days. Nothing appeared on a market stall by accident. Behind every loaf, every basket of vegetables, and every piece of meat stood an invisible chain of labor stretching far beyond London's streets. Seasonal change shaped these markets as much as human effort did. A successful harvest meant fuller stalls and greater confidence among merchants, while poor weather could quickly reduce supplies and raise prices. People understood that their lives remained closely tied to nature, regardless of how prosperous the city became. Even London's busiest districts ultimately depended on fields, rivers, orchards, and farms that lay beyond the horizon, reminding everyone that urban life could never exist entirely on its own. Preserving food presented another constant challenge. Without refrigeration, households relied on techniques refined over generations. Salt, drying, smoking, pickling, and careful storage extended the usefulness of many products, allowing families to prepare for seasons when fresh supplies became less predictable. These methods demanded patience and experience. A mistake could mean losing precious provisions collected through weeks of difficult work, making knowledge itself one of the household's most valuable resources. Markets also served another purpose that cannot be measured simply by commerce. They were the city's information network. Travelers arriving from distant towns carried stories of political disputes, changing weather, successful harvests, unusual events, and opportunities waiting elsewhere. Merchants exchanged news as naturally as they exchanged goods, and before long those stories spread through workshops, taverns, churches, and homes. Long before newspapers or printed bulletins existed, information traveled from voice to voice, changing slightly with every retelling yet remaining essential to daily life. This constant movement of people and ideas gave London remarkable energy. New fashions appeared. Foreign products attracted curious buyers. Different languages could be heard within a single afternoon, reflecting commercial relationships that stretched across the English Channel and far beyond. To those living there, these connections represented progress and prosperity. Few could imagine that the same routes carrying opportunity might someday carry something far less welcome. For historians today, this growing web of exchange reveals one of the defining characteristics of 14th-century Europe. Cities were no longer isolated communities separated by vast distances, but active participants in an increasingly interconnected world. Trade encouraged wealth, supported innovation, and strengthened political relationships. Yet every new connection also reduced the barriers that had once slowed the movement of unexpected dangers. It was a transformation celebrated by contemporaries, though its hidden consequences would only become visible later. As another busy market day drew to a close, merchants packed away unsold goods, apprentices swept the streets, and families returned home carrying enough food to sustain them for another day. Nothing about the scene suggested that history stood on the threshold of extraordinary change. The city remained full of optimism, its routines intact, its confidence unshaken. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all. The moments that appear most ordinary to those living through them often become the moments future generations recognize as the calm before everything changed. For many people living in medieval London, illness was not an unusual interruption, but a familiar part of life. A fever, an infected wound, or a persistent cough could appear without warning, and families relied on experience as much as formal medicine to decide what should be done next. The first response often came from within the household itself, where generations had passed down practical remedies made from herbs, honey, vinegar, and other readily available ingredients. These treatments reflected centuries of accumulated observation, even if the invisible causes of disease remained beyond anyone's understanding. When an illness became more serious, those who could afford it sought the advice of a physician. Medieval doctors did not practice medicine randomly. Many had spent years studying respected texts copied and preserved by scholars across Europe. Their education drew upon traditions inherited from Greek and Roman medicine, enriched by the work of Islamic physicians whose writings had reached Western Europe through translation. They examined symptoms carefully, questioned patients about their condition, and recommended treatments that they believed restored the body's natural balance. Although modern science has replaced many of those ideas, the physicians themselves were engaged in a sincere attempt to understand the human body using the evidence available in their own time. Not everyone, however, had access to trained physicians. Barbers often performed minor surgical procedures, treated wounds, and assisted with practical medical care, while local healers earned the trust of their communities through years of experience. Monasteries also played an important role by preserving medical knowledge and caring for the sick who arrived at their gates. In many places, healing was not concentrated in a single profession, but shared among individuals whose skills reflected different traditions and responsibilities. Medical care looked very different from today's hospitals, yet it formed a network that reached far more people than many imagine. Religion naturally shaped how illness was understood. Prayer offered comfort during times of uncertainty, and churches became places where families sought both spiritual reassurance and practical support from their communities. Faith and medicine were not necessarily seen as opposing forces. Many people believed that seeking treatment while also praying for recovery represented complementary responses to suffering. For them, healing involved both the body and the soul, and neither could be ignored during moments of great distress. Despite these efforts, uncertainty remained a constant companion. A patient with symptoms that appeared mild one day could worsen rapidly the next, leaving even experienced practitioners searching for explanations. Without microscopes or laboratory testing, diagnosis depended almost entirely on what could be seen, heard, and felt. Physicians observed the color of the skin, measured changes in breathing, examined urine, listened to descriptions of pain, and compared each case with those they had encountered before. Their methods lacked modern precision, but they reveal an enduring human instinct to search patiently for patterns even when certainty remains out of reach. Looking back, it is easy to focus on what medieval medicine could not accomplish. Yet doing so risks overlooking its greatest achievement. It represented a determined effort to bring order to uncertainty, combining scholarship, observation, practical experience, and compassion in a world where answers were often painfully limited. The people providing care did not believe they understood everything. Like scientists in every age, they worked within the boundaries of the knowledge available to them, hoping that careful study would gradually illuminate what still remained hidden. As winter gave way to spring, few physicians could have imagined that those limits were about to be tested more severely than ever before. Across Europe, scattered reports described an illness unlike anything many communities remembered, one that seemed to spread with alarming speed and leave behind questions that no familiar treatment could fully answer. At first, these accounts sounded distant, almost unbelievable, carried by travelers whose stories blended fact with rumor. Yet, with every passing week, the distance separating London from those reports seemed just a little smaller, and the ordinary confidence that had long defined daily life began, almost imperceptibly, to give way to quiet uncertainty. The city never truly slept. Even before the first pale light reached the towers of London's churches, movement had already begun along its narrow streets. A baker added another bundle of firewood to the oven. A ferryman untied his boat from the riverbank, and somewhere behind heavy wooden doors, a family gathered around a small fire before another demanding day. To them, this morning was no different from hundreds that had come before. The world felt familiar, dependable, and comfortably predictable. No one paused to wonder whether future generations would remember this year more than any other. In 1348, London stood at the center of a kingdom that was changing faster than many realized. The city had expanded well beyond its Roman origins, attracting merchants, craftsmen, laborers, scholars, clergy, and travelers from across England and beyond. Ships arrived along the River Thames carrying wool, wine, timber, grain, salt, cloth, and news from distant ports. Every successful voyage strengthened London's prosperity and widened its connections with the rest of Europe. Trade was more than business. It was the lifeblood of the city, feeding its markets, supporting its workshops, and encouraging people to believe that tomorrow would bring even greater opportunity. To modern eyes, medieval London can seem impossibly crowded. Houses lean toward one another across winding lanes, their timber frames creating streets that often felt enclosed even beneath an open sky. Yet this arrangement reflected necessity rather than carelessness. Space inside the city walls was valuable, and generations had adapted by building upward instead of outward whenever possible. Families, apprentices, servants, and sometimes entire businesses shared the same buildings, transforming every home into both a private residence and a place of work. The streets formed a world of constant activity. Horses pulled loaded carts toward busy markets, apprentices carried tools between workshops, and vendors called out to passing customers in hopes of making another sale. The sounds blended into a rhythm that every resident understood instinctively. Iron striking iron from the blacksmith's forge, the steady rumble of wooden wheels over uneven ground, the voices of merchants negotiating prices, and the distant ringing of church bells combined to create the soundtrack of medieval urban life. To visitors, the city might have appeared overwhelming. To its inhabitants, it simply sounded like home. Keeping such a city alive required an extraordinary amount of organization. Every loaf of bread depended on farmers, millers, bakers, and transporters working together. Fresh fish reached the markets through the efforts of fishermen who left before dawn, while meat, vegetables, and firewood all arrived through separate networks that stretched far into the surrounding countryside. The people of London rarely considered the complexity of these systems because they encountered only the finished result. Yet behind every ordinary purchase stood countless hours of labor performed by individuals whose names history would never record. Water shaped daily life more than almost any other resource. It was needed for cooking, brewing, washing clothing, cleaning tools, caring for animals, and preparing meals. Public conduits supplied some neighborhoods, wells served others, and professional water carriers earned their living transporting heavy containers through crowded streets. Every bucket represented time and effort. Unlike the effortless convenience of modern plumbing, water in medieval London was a resource that demanded planning, strength, and careful use. That reality influenced attitudes toward cleanliness in ways that are often misunderstood today. Medieval people did not simply ignore hygiene, nor did they believe personal cleanliness was unimportant. Bathing, washing hands, laundering clothes, and cleaning living spaces all played a role in everyday life whenever circumstances allowed. The challenge was not a lack of interest, but the practical limitations of obtaining sufficient water, heating it, and carrying it where it was needed. Cleanliness existed on a spectrum shaped by occupation, wealth, season, and access to resources rather than by indifference. Inside many homes, daily routines followed patterns refined over generations. Meals were prepared over open hearths that also provided warmth during colder months. Smoke drifted upward through roofs designed to release it as effectively as contemporary construction allowed, while wooden furniture, handmade tools, and carefully repaired clothing reflected a culture in which possessions were expected to last for years. Almost nothing was discarded casually. Materials were reused, repaired, or adapted because replacing them required considerable effort and expense. The marketplace brought together every layer of London's society. Noble households purchased luxury goods imported from overseas. Craftsmen searched for raw materials. Laborers stretched modest earnings to feed their families, and foreign merchants introduced products that many local residents had never seen before. Markets were also places where information spread with remarkable speed. Travelers shared stories from distant regions, sailors described conditions in foreign ports, and merchants exchanged rumors that sometimes traveled farther than the goods themselves. Information moved differently in the 14th century. Without newspapers or rapid communication, knowledge passed from one person to another through conversation, letters, official messengers, and travelers. A report leaving an Italian port could take weeks to reach England, changing slightly each time it was repeated along the journey. By the time news reached London streets, certainty and speculation often stood side by side, making it difficult for anyone to separate fact from rumor. Yet people listened carefully, because in an interconnected world, distant events increasingly shaped local lives. No one living in London understood how deeply connected Europe had become. Roads, rivers, and sea routes linked cities more closely than ever before, allowing ideas, technologies, commerce, and culture to travel across remarkable distances. These connections enriched kingdoms and expanded opportunities, encouraging confidence in a future built upon trade and cooperation. But every network that carries prosperity also carries risk. Long before anyone recognized the danger, the same routes that transported valuable goods were quietly becoming pathways for something far more consequential. For now, however, the city remained full of optimism. Workshops stayed busy, ships continued arriving with profitable cargoes, churches welcomed worshippers throughout the week, and families planned for harvests, marriages, apprenticeships, and celebrations still months away. Daily life encouraged the comforting belief that tomorrow would resemble today, just as yesterday had resembled the day before. History has a way of disguising its greatest turning points behind the appearance of normality, and nowhere was that more evident than in London during the opening months of 1348. Every thriving city depends on systems that most people rarely notice. In modern London, they are buried beneath streets or hidden behind walls, operating so quietly that millions can live their lives without ever wondering how clean water reaches a kitchen or where yesterday's waste disappears. Medieval London was no different in principle. Its residents relied on an intricate web of solutions that had evolved over centuries, each one shaped by the knowledge, technology, and resources available at the time. They may appear simple by today's standards, but together they allowed one of Europe's busiest cities to function day after day. Supplying water was among the greatest challenges. Some neighborhoods drew it from public conduits fed by springs outside the city, while others relied on wells or the River Thames itself for different purposes. Professional water carriers became a familiar sight, balancing heavy containers across their shoulders or loading barrels onto carts before making deliveries to homes, workshops, and inns. Every journey demanded physical endurance, and every bucket represented a resource that had been earned rather than effortlessly obtained. Water was valuable not because people ignored its importance, but because securing it required constant labor. Once inside a household, that water was used thoughtfully. A family might begin by preparing food or brewing ale, continue with washing cooking utensils, and later use what remained for cleaning floors or other practical tasks before it was finally discarded. This careful sequence reflected necessity rather than neglect. In a world where every container had to be filled by human effort, wastefulness was a luxury very few could afford. Efficiency became part of everyday life, quietly influencing habits passed from one generation to the next. The streets themselves demanded constant attention. City officials issued regulations intended to keep main routes open, reduce obstructions, and encourage residents to maintain the areas immediately outside their homes. Enforcement was not always consistent, and conditions varied from one neighborhood to another, yet these rules reveal an important reality. Medieval authorities understood that a growing city required management. They recognized that crowded streets, busy markets, and expanding populations created practical problems that could not simply be ignored. Waste disposal posed one of the greatest logistical challenges. Households, workshops, and stables all produced materials that had to be removed from the places where people lived and worked. Laborers collected refuse, carts carried loads beyond the busiest districts, and certain trades even found ways to reuse materials that still held value. The system was imperfect, especially as the population increased, but it was neither random nor entirely unplanned. Like every other aspect of urban life, it represented an ongoing effort to balance limited resources with growing demand. Animals formed another essential part of the city's daily rhythm. Horses pulled wagons through crowded lanes, oxen transported heavy goods, pigs wandered in some districts under controlled conditions, and chickens could often be found within household yards. These animals supplied food, labor, transportation, and income, making them indispensable to medieval society. Yet their presence also added complexity to an already crowded environment, requiring constant attention from owners and officials alike to prevent conflict and maintain order. The River Thames remained London's greatest ally. It carried merchants, fishermen, ferries, and cargo vessels through the heart of the city, connecting local markets with distant ports across northern Europe. Every tide transformed the waterfront into a scene of remarkable activity as crews unloaded barrels, rolled crates across wooden docks, and prepared ships for their next voyage. To many residents, the river symbolized prosperity itself. It was the reason London could compete with larger trading centers and continue attracting ambitious people from every corner of the kingdom. Few paused to consider that prosperity always carried a hidden price. Every ship arriving from abroad represented more than profitable trade. It also reflected an increasingly interconnected continent where goods, travelers, animals, and ideas moved with unprecedented frequency. No customs officer, harbor master, or merchant possessed the scientific understanding to recognize that invisible organisms could travel alongside perfectly ordinary cargo. To everyone watching from the docks, another arriving vessel simply meant another successful day for the city. That is what makes the history of 1348 so compelling. The greatest threat facing London could not be seen from a watchtower or measured by the city's defenses. Its walls remained strong, its markets remained busy, and its government continued performing the ordinary business of administration. Yet history often changes not because familiar systems suddenly collapse, but because they encounter a challenge they were never designed to withstand. Before the first unmistakable signs of crisis appeared, the city was still operating exactly as it always had, confident, industrious, and entirely unaware that the foundations of its ordinary world were about to face the greatest test in living memory. For the people of London, the passing seasons dictated far more than the weather. They determined when grain would be harvested, when livestock would be driven toward the city, when river travel became easier, and whether food would remain plentiful or begin to grow scarce. Every household understood that prosperity depended upon forces beyond human control. A mild spring inspired confidence, while an unusually wet summer or a harsh winter could alter prices, shorten supplies, and place enormous pressure on families already living with little margin for hardship. Nature was not an occasional influence. It was an active partner in everyday survival. Despite these uncertainties, London continued to expand with remarkable determination. New workshops appeared wherever space allowed. Established guilds welcomed apprentices eager to master valuable trades, and merchants invested in larger shipments that reflected growing confidence in international commerce. Success encouraged more people to settle inside the city, each bringing new skills, ambitions, and expectations. Growth became both London's greatest strength and its greatest challenge, because every additional resident increased the demands placed upon streets, wells, markets, homes, and public services that had evolved for a much smaller population. Within the city walls, neighborhoods developed distinct identities. Some streets became known for skilled metal workers whose workshops rang with the sound of hammers from dawn until dusk. Others attracted cloth merchants displaying fabrics imported from distant regions, while nearby alleys housed carpenters, leatherworkers, and artisans whose craftsmanship supported nearly every aspect of urban life. These districts formed tightly connected communities where reputations mattered, neighbors depended upon one another, and professional knowledge passed carefully from experienced masters to younger generations preparing to inherit their trades. The rhythm of work left little room for idleness. A blacksmith's fire demanded constant attention. A baker's oven could not be abandoned at the wrong moment, and merchants carefully watched changing prices that might determine whether a trading season ended in profit or disappointment. Time itself carried a different meaning than it does today. Without the relentless precision of modern clocks, daily routines followed sunlight, church bells, and the practical demands of each occupation. People measured success less by speed than by consistency, knowing that steady effort often mattered more than haste. As evening approached, the city gradually changed its character. Market stalls disappeared beneath wooden covers, workshops closed their doors, and families gathered around hearths where simple meals marked the end of another demanding day. Candlelight and firelight replaced the bright activity of daylight, casting long shadows across timber walls while conversations drifted through homes filled with the familiar sounds of children, neighbors, and shared routines. For many, these quiet hours offered the only opportunity to rest before another sunrise began the cycle once again. Yet beyond London's walls, the wider world never stood still. Across Europe, merchants continued crossing mountain passes, sailors navigated busy sea routes, and caravans carried valuable cargo between kingdoms separated by hundreds of miles. Alongside those journeys traveled letters, rumors, diplomatic messages, religious pilgrims, and countless ordinary travelers whose names have long since vanished from history. Together, they formed an invisible network connecting communities that would never meet face to face, yet remained bound together by commerce and constant movement. In the early months of 1348, fragments of troubling news began appearing with greater frequency. Stories spoke of towns where illness spread with unusual speed, of communities struggling to understand a sickness that seemed to strike without warning, and of physicians encountering symptoms unlike those described in familiar medical texts. At first, these reports sounded inconsistent, almost impossible to verify. Distances were vast, communication was slow, and extraordinary stories often became even more extraordinary as they passed from one traveler to the next. Many listeners believed the truth must surely be less alarming than the rumors suggested. Still, uncertainty has a quiet way of growing. A merchant arriving from the continent might repeat a story heard in another port. Weeks later, a sailor could describe something surprisingly similar despite having followed a completely different route. Then a visiting cleric might mention concerns raised in correspondence from yet another distant city. Individually, these accounts proved very little. Together, they hinted that scattered incidents might not be isolated after all. Questions slowly replaced confidence, although few people could yet imagine the scale of what was unfolding. For London's residents, however, life continued much as before. Children laughed in the streets, church services welcomed familiar congregations, craftsmen honored existing contracts, and ships continued arriving with cargoes that promised another prosperous trading season. The city remained busy, ambitious, and hopeful. It is precisely this contrast that gives the year 1348 its enduring power. While ordinary life continued with reassuring familiarity, history was already gathering momentum beyond the horizon, moving silently toward a city that still believed tomorrow would look exactly like today. Rumors have always traveled faster than certainty. In medieval Europe, where the speed of information depended on the pace of a horse, the tide of a river, or the wind filling a ship's sails, every story changed slightly before reaching its destination. A merchant arriving in London might speak of an unusual sickness in a distant port, only for another traveler to dismiss the account as exaggerated. Weeks later, a sailor from an entirely different route could describe similar scenes, not knowing that his words echoed reports carried by strangers hundreds of miles away. No single account was enough to convince an entire city, but together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, most Londoners had little reason to fear events unfolding on the other side of Europe. Disease was not uncommon, and outbreaks of illness had appeared throughout history without transforming the entire continent. Families had learned to live with uncertainty. They had endured harsh winters, poor harvests, local epidemics, and political unrest before, and life had always continued. Experience encouraged resilience, and resilience often encouraged optimism. It seemed reasonable to believe that whatever was happening elsewhere would remain a distant problem. The city's leaders faced a similar challenge. Officials depended on reports that were often incomplete, delayed, or contradictory. Decisions could not be based on rumors alone, especially when London's prosperity relied upon the uninterrupted movement of merchants and cargo through its gates and along the Thames. Closing trade without compelling evidence would have carried enormous economic consequences, affecting livelihoods across the city. Every choice involved balancing caution against necessity, a dilemma that governments throughout history have repeatedly encountered. Meanwhile, the port remained as active as ever. Cranes creaked beneath heavy loads, dockworkers rolled barrels across wooden wharves, and scribes carefully recorded incoming shipments destined for markets throughout the kingdom. Ships arrived bearing familiar cargoes and familiar faces, their crews eager to exchange goods before preparing for the next voyage. To those standing along the waterfront, commerce appeared unstoppable. The river continued to deliver opportunity exactly as it had for generations, offering no visible sign that history itself was quietly approaching with every incoming tide. Beyond the docks, physicians continued treating ordinary ailments. They visited patients suffering from injuries, seasonal fevers, infections, and the countless illnesses that accompanied medieval life. Their notebooks grew with observations gathered through years of practice, each case reinforcing knowledge accumulated from respected teachers and ancient medical authorities. Nothing in their education had prepared them for a crisis on the scale that Europe was about to experience, yet they approached every patient with the same careful attention that had long defined their profession. Their greatest limitation was not dedication, but the invisible nature of the enemy they were unknowingly preparing to confront. Within households, life retained its familiar rhythm. Bread was baked, clothing repaired, tools sharpened, and children taught the practical skills that would one day sustain families of their own. Weddings were planned, apprentices completed their training, and neighbors borrowed supplies from one another just as they always had. These ordinary moments rarely appear in medieval chronicles, yet they remind us of an essential truth. History is lived through everyday routines long before it is remembered through extraordinary events. As spring advanced, however, conversations gradually changed. Reports arriving from continental Europe became more frequent, and although details differed, they shared an unsettling consistency. Entire communities were said to be struggling with an illness that spread rapidly and left physicians searching for explanations. Some described crowded churchyards. Others spoke of abandoned homes, while many admitted that no one seemed able to explain why certain places suffered more severely than others. Certainty remained elusive, but confidence was beginning to fade. Imagine standing in a crowded London market as these stories circulate among merchants and travelers. Around you, business continues as usual. Coins change hands, wagons arrive with fresh produce, and craftsmen discuss their next commissions. Yet beneath those ordinary conversations, another question quietly begins to surface. What if the rumors are true? It is a question nobody wants to ask aloud, because giving voice to uncertainty can make distant fears feel unexpectedly close. By the time summer approached, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. No official proclamation announced the beginning of a crisis, and no single event marked the end of normal life. Instead, concern spread gradually through conversations, private letters, and whispered discussions between neighbors. Looking back across the centuries, we can identify this moment with remarkable clarity. The people living through it could not. They stood at the threshold of one of history's greatest turning points without realizing they had already taken the first steps toward a future that would forever change the city they called home. There was no single day when London suddenly became a city of fear. The transformation unfolded so gradually that many residents failed to notice it at first. Conversations grew quieter whenever travelers from the continent arrived with fresh accounts. Merchants who had once spoken enthusiastically about distant ports now paused before answering simple questions about recent voyages. Even the busiest taverns, where stories usually became larger with every telling, carried an unfamiliar hesitation. Something unusual was happening across Europe, and although no one could yet describe it with certainty, uncertainty itself had begun to spread. For physicians, the first challenge was not treatment but recognition. Every illness had to be measured against years of accumulated experience, and unusual symptoms did not immediately suggest an entirely new threat. A fever might resemble countless fevers that had come before. Swollen glands could easily be mistaken for conditions already described in respected medical texts. The human mind naturally searches for familiar explanations before accepting unfamiliar ones, and medieval doctors were no different. Their training encouraged careful observation, but no amount of study could prepare them for an event without precedent in living memory. Merchants found themselves facing difficult choices. Commerce depended on trust, and trust depended on movement. Ships waiting too long in harbor meant delayed profits, spoiled cargo, and growing financial pressure on everyone connected to the trade. Every captain wanted to continue sailing. Every trader hoped business would remain uninterrupted, and every laborer depended on those decisions for daily wages. The city's prosperity had always relied upon openness, yet that same openness now carried questions that nobody knew how to answer. Inside London's churches, prayers continued to follow the familiar calendar of the Christian year. Candles burned before stone altars. Choirs filled vaulted spaces with voices that echoed beneath timber roofs, and priests reminded their congregations that uncertainty had always been part of the human condition. For many families, these familiar rituals offered stability at a moment when reliable information remained frustratingly scarce. Faith could not eliminate fear, but it gave people a language through which to face it together. Daily life, however, refused to stand still. Children still chased one another through narrow lanes. Apprentices still hurried between workshops carrying tools and materials, and market stalls still opened at sunrise. It is one of history's quiet paradoxes that ordinary routines often continue long after extraordinary events have already begun. People still needed bread, fresh water, firewood, clothing, and shelter. Every practical task that had sustained London before the rumors arrived remained just as necessary afterward. As reports became more consistent, one detail appeared again and again. Communities described an illness that moved rapidly through households, leaving families little time to understand what was happening before another relative became sick. Chroniclers struggled to describe what they witnessed, not because they lacked words, but because the scale of the suffering exceeded ordinary experience. The disease did not simply challenge medical knowledge. It challenged the belief that familiar patterns could explain every crisis. Looking back with modern understanding, we know that Europe's growing commercial network allowed goods, animals, and people to travel between regions more efficiently than ever before. To those living in 1348, however, these connections remained symbols of prosperity rather than vulnerability. The roads, rivers, and sea lanes that enriched kingdoms had become so ordinary that few imagined they could also carry unseen dangers. It was a lesson history would repeat many times in the centuries that followed, reminding every generation that progress often brings unexpected responsibilities alongside its rewards. As summer advanced, London still appeared remarkably resilient. The city gates opened each morning, the Thames remained crowded with vessels, and the markets echoed with familiar voices bargaining over grain, cloth, fish, and livestock. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, attitudes were beginning to shift. People listened more carefully to strangers, paid closer attention to distant news, and found themselves wondering whether events unfolding far beyond the horizon might soon become impossible to ignore. No proclamation announced that the old sense of certainty had ended. Instead, it faded quietly, one conversation at a time, as the city unknowingly approached the defining chapter of its history.